So just a few years after Kiss Me Kate was brought up to the big screen, there happened the premiere of a completely different Shakespearean musical, namely West Side Story, a tragedy. This was something completely new. This was one of the game changers, and still, for many historians of the musical theatre, this is either their best, the musical that they believe is the best, or their favorite musical, or the musical that they believe changed the genre the most. It premiered in 1957, so just a few years after this very traditional musical that Kiss Me Kate was put on film. And West Side Story was adapted from Romeo and Juliet. Some critics say that it became the favorite Shakespearean play of America. There was a lot of American interest, if you remember the term, because the whole story was modernized and it was brought to contemporary New York. You may open any page, I don't know, Wikipedia page, and read about the creative team, and they were the man who came up with the idea, a choreographer and director, Jerome Robbins, the author of the book, so the libretto, Arthur Lawrence, the composer, Leonard Bernstein, and the lyricist, big name, the man that we are going to meet during this course several times, Stephen Sondheim. He debuted here as a lyricist. So later his career would include also composing music. There is a long and quite interesting story about the background of West Side Story. Actually, originally it was supposed to be called the East Side Story, and of course, the major Shakespearean idea of the conflict between two groups, two ethnic groups rather than two noble houses, was there from the beginning, but originally it was supposed to happen in Lower East Side on the Isle of Manhattan, and the conflict was supposed to be between poorer Italian Catholics and slightly richer Jews from this area of New York. It was supposed to happen in the spring, where the important celebrations for the two communities, Easter and Passover, were supposed to be happen. But the creative team met. They weren't very happy with this idea. They left it out for a couple of years, and then they met again in Hollywood while they were working on other projects. And one of them read a newspaper article about some ethnic violence in Los Angeles, which was happening among the Mexican immigrants. So they decided, why don't we do this? But they felt, especially Lawrence, the author of the libretto, felt that he was still happier to write about New York than Los Angeles, so the Mexican minority was substituted with the Puerto Rican minority. So that's really the beginning, from East Side Story to West Side Story. The musical was very successful, but the film version, which was made in 1961, beat all the records, basically. So they had 11 won Oscars out of 10 won Oscars out of 11 nominations. This is a record for any musical. So there were Some of the actors reprised their roles from the stage. Some of them were new. Some of the creative team work on the film as well, especially Jerome Robbins, who was responsible for the choreography. If you watched the musical or the film, you know how important the dancing is for West Side Story. Robbins was a very important man in the creation of this musical. There were some problems. He was dismissed from the set because he spent too much money from the budget. But anyway, he was even credited in the film. So most adaptations, and of course West Side Story is such an adaptation, appear in a specific time and place. So we have, of course, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, but this is thoroughly modernized. So this was a story about young people, but this was one of the first musicals that was aimed at a younger audience. This is before the coming of the rock musical. So we do not have rock music here. We have jazz as the music of the Jets, the Americans, the white Americans, mostly Italian, Irish, and Polish. We have another Polish character, if you remember. Tony is supposed to be at least partially Polish. And their music is mostly jazz inspired, and we have the ethnic Latino rhythms of the Puerto Ricans, the Sharks. So rather than clan vendetta, rather than aristocratic families which have duels and it's all almost fairy tale like, kind of dark fairy tale like. Everything in West Side Story is modern. So we don't have anyone from the upper class. We don't have vendetta. We have racism, xenophobia, intolerance between different ethnic groups, and they all live in a very shabby, poor, neglected neighborhood of West Side. So the two noble families are replaced by two gangs, and the duels, the sword fights are replaced by knife fights and gun shooting and such very modern problems. If you observe the plot, however, a lot is taken straight from Shakespeare, but not the language. Just like we had in Kiss Me Kate, West Side Story does not use the original language of Shakespeare's plays. The language is modern, American English, the problems are modern, but the main archetypal story is the same. So two young people who fall in love with the members of the opposite groups. So the main character, the equivalent of Romeo, is Tony. He used to be a member of the Jets. He is still the best friend of their current leader, Riff, who's the equivalent of Shakespeare's Mercutio. But at the beginning of the musical, Tony wants to change his life. He wants to become an honest man. But of course, fate intervenes in the person of Juliet, who is not Juliet but Maria, a sister of the leader of the Sharks, newly come to America from Puerto Rico. And we have, of course, Bernardo, the leader of the Sharks, who is a combination of at least two Shakespearean characters. the head of the Capulets, and Tybalt, the cousin of Juliet. We have the young man that Bernardo wants Maria to marry, called Chino, who is the equivalent of Prince Paris from Shakespeare's tragedy. However, there is a ball, of course not a ball that you might find in Renaissance Verona, but a dancing party in which the two groups are present, and the star-crossed love happens. The young and innocent girl falls in love, reciprocated love, with the young man from the opposite side of the conflict, that is Tony. We have some scenes reminiscent or reworking Shakespeare's famous scenes. So we do not have the balcony scene, but we have the scene behind the poor tenement house on the fire escapes, which might, with some degree of imagination, resemble balconies. A lot of dancing, a lot of ethnically inspired music, and all this is used to convey the message, to convey the meaning. If you read the article I will send you, you'll get some quotes from the historians and the critics, which say that the plot is not very complicated, it's rather simple, but nevertheless, West Side Story is very innovative, trailblazing musical that would really influence the genre for the years to come. So probably the most important difference is taking away all veneer of the fairy tale, of the upper class mystique, of the lords and ladies, and the beauty that comes with the money. Nobody here has the money. So the question is the love the same? Is the conflict the same? When it's stripped away from all nobility? I guess the creators of West Side Story seem to say yes, it is the same, and especially love is the same. Another important change is that there are hardly any adults. There is Doc, who might be seen as the equivalent of sympathetic friar who tries to help Romeo and Juliet, Friar Lawrence. But there are no parents. There are the policemen, but they are very incompetent and they are basically helpless. One of the new important subjects that you do not have in Shakespeare's original is the critique of the whole system, of social help, of social security, of the police, the courts, the social workers. And here we have another novelty song. This is the moment to watch it. Gee, Officer Krupke. Officer Krupke is the incompetent policeman who tries to keep the peace in the neighborhood. And the novelty song with brilliant lyrics by Sondheim is a very good critique of the whole system. A very it is comical, but it's very bitter humor because it shows the circular logic of the whole system. So the officer arrests the young man for some social disturbance. They are brought to the judge. The judge sends them to the social worker. The social worker sends them to a person responsible for finding jobs for the young people, but they cannot find the job, so they are back on the streets and again arrested by the police. So it's a perfectly circular logic, and the young delinquents from the Jets who sing this song as a kind of theater within theater almost, are very well aware of the fact that the system does nothing to help them, and it's perfectly circular, and nobody knows what to do with the material problems, with the ethnic violence, with the intolerance and racism, and they just don't know what to do. So there's been some opinions by the critics that still the Jets, the Native Americans, those whose parents came a few generations earlier to America than the Latino people, they have more interest of the creators of the musical, that they are more individualized than the Sharks, because if you look at the Sharks, basically only Bernardo gets an individuality, but if you look at the Jets, there are different types. So some of them are more violent, more aggressive, some of them are clowns, some of them are more innocent. So we have more individualized characters in the Jets than in the Sharks, which might be seen as perhaps a means of steering the audience's sympathy towards the Jets rather than the Sharks. But if you think about it, the Sharks have better music and better dancers and better clothes, so perhaps it's more balanced than some critics admit. Another very important difference is, of course, the ending. If you remember Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, it ends with the double suicide of Romeo and Juliet, which only brings about the peace between the two families. So Romeo killed Juliet's cousin Tybalt. He had to flee from the law from Verona. Juliet took a drug, so everybody believed that she died. She sent a letter to Romeo. Romeo never got the letter in time. He learned that Juliet died, so he came back to Verona to kill himself on Juliet's grave. Just as she woke up, she found him poisoned next to her tomb, and she stabbed herself with his knife. That's the end of Romeo and Juliet. Only then the families arrive, the parents, they start, of course, despairing and crying, and they realize it's time to finish the war. With West Side Story, some of this is kept. So Bernardo kills Riff, so just like Tybalt killed Mercutio, so Tony continues the revenge and kills Bernardo, Maria's brother. Then he runs away and hides himself in the shop run by Doc. However, Maria decides to forgive him, and she sends her best friend Anita to give him the news that she wants to run away together. And now something different happens. Anita comes to the shop and the other Jets, the other friends of Riff and Tony, harass her and almost rape her. They would have raped her if it wasn't for the intervention by the dog. And Anita is shocked, and she decides to take revenge because Bernardo was her boyfriend. And now he's dead. So she says that Chino killed Maria. So Maria is dead. Tony hears that. He runs out into the street, shouting for Chino to kill him as well, now that Maria is dead. But he meets Maria and they run towards each other, and at this precise moment Chino shoots and kills or wounds Tony so he can die in Maria's arms. And this would be more or less Shakespearean, but now something different happens because if you remember the end of the musical, Tony dies in Maria's arms. She takes the gun and she starts pointing the gun to the members of both the Sharks and the Jets that run out into the street after them. So it looks very plausible that she will kill somebody, perhaps then kill herself, but she doesn't. She decides, Maria, Juliet, decides to end the chain of violence. And it looks like she's successful because at least the members of both groups, of both gangs, take away the body of Tony. So Maria's sacrifice, Maria's decision to stop the violence, to stop killing, to refrain from suicide as well, is seen as hope, as perhaps the only ray of hope for these people. And this is a very interesting change because it would be more romantic, it would be more Shakespearean, that if you have two young lovers who cannot be together in life, let them be together in death. Very romantic, very, well, tragic. But this, as some of the critics observe, and I think correctly, would draw the attention to the fact that the peace brought by the suicides of Romeo and Juliet strengthens the belief of the audience into the state, in the state and in the family. So that there are two stable things in life, the family and the state. And Shakespeare's play has it. West Side Story does away with that. The state is there, so the police arrive, but they are as helpless as ever. The family is not there. Where are the parents of all these kids? Nobody knows. So, the world of old certainties of the stable family and the stable state is no more in the modern world. So this could be the reason why West Side Story does away with this conventional tragic ending with the double death, because that's the only way that you can have a little bit of hope in this musical. So yeah, then we'll talk about other Shakespearean musicals.